Thank you all. So, of course, the most intense contact of the Serbs as a nation with the revolution of 1848 was that of the Serbs in Hungary, in what is today Vojvodina in Serbia, who had a very conflicting situation there because at first they aided the Hungarian revolution, but then when they were disillusioned as they did not receive the autonomy that they had expected from the Hungarians, then they turned to the Austrian side and helped suppress the revolution. And that is also a very interesting subject that one could talk about, but that is not the main subject of my presentation. My subject is how that affected the situation in Serbia. So let us first see what is Serbia like in 1848. Serbia is at that point an autonomous principality formally under the sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire. It gained its autonomy in 1830. The struggle for it began earlier with the first uprising of 1804 and so on, but formally the Sultan's Hati Humayun giving Serbia complete internal autonomy was passed in 1830. Serbia tried to pass its constitution in 1835, and it was a fairly modern constitution by the standards of the time, but unfortunately Serbia did that completely on its own. That was Prince Miloš Obrenović at the time, and naturally the Ottoman sovereign was not so happy that a part of his territory issued a constitution, and neither were Austria and Russia, who were the main protectors of Serbia at the time. So Miloš was told the constitution had to go, and go it did within less than 2 months. So it essentially remained just on paper. But as the constitution was promised to the people in 1838, so after 3 years, after some negotiations with the Porte, again, another Hati Humayun, an act of the Sultans, was issued, which is known in Serbia as the Turkish constitution. It was essentially a constitution of Serbia, but granted from above, from the Ottoman Sultan as sovereign. It was more limited than the one Serbia had previously passed, not just in terms of its own independence. The Porte again started interfering a little in Serbia's internal affairs, but also say in the sense that the National Assembly, which was a constitutional category in 35, was not mentioned at all in 38, that the catalogue of citizens' rights was much more narrow, and so on. But still, even the Act of 1830 and the one of 38, for example, abolished the Ottoman, let's call it feudal system, the Timar system in Serbia, abolished corvees, and so on. Shortly after the constitution, Prince Miloš Obrenović abdicated. His young son was afterwards deposed in 42, and Aleksandar Karađorđević, the son of the famous Karađorđe who led the first uprising against the Ottomans, was brought to be the prince, but he was a very limited prince because essentially a court camarilla that had brought him ruled in his stead, those who were members of the state council, the second main governing body next to the prince, and that period of his reign, and essentially their reign, is called the reign of the defenders of the constitution. So they defended the Turkish constitution, which one might wonder whether we should call it a constitution at all, but for Serbia it was the most constitutional act we had at the time, if one can measure constitutionality. But an interesting thing I want to add, inspired by what we heard in the Italian presentation today, was that during this time, for example, the Serbian Civil Code was passed in 44, and it was mostly inspired by the Austrian one. It was written by Jovan Hadžić, a Serb who had come from Hungary, and he had used the Austrian model, but in some places he made changes, and one of them was the introduction to the code, where he added essentially a catalogue of citizens' rights, because that was what was missing from the current constitution. He wanted to legalize them in some other way. So essentially, this regime was a very bureaucratic state. We could call it a police state. State officials were the upper class. There were officially no estates, no differences between men, but naturally, anyone who worked for the state had a much better position than the common people, and those defenders of the Constitution essentially saw themselves as adults governing a state of children. So people who simply don't have the capacity to think for themselves. And in a period of such reign, we get liberal ideas coming from the outside. At that point, we already have a group of liberals. I won't call them a party because political parties were not legal yet, but we have a liberal movement that was generally already fighting as much as they could for a more liberal legislation, and now hearing the echoes of the revolution all over Europe, but most closely in Hungary, they start fighting for something more. And a National Assembly is summoned on St. Peter's Day in 1848. I said the National Assembly was not mentioned in the Constitution, and it was not, but it had been summoned a few times prior, in 42 and 43, as an institution of customary law, because since the uprisings, assemblies were called forth to essentially provide a means of communication between the ruler and the people. So the people would just gather, they would tell the prince their problems, the issues they had, they would make some proposals, all of that in a very informal atmosphere. Imagine a village gathering, just many times bigger, and then the ruler would do as he saw fit with what he had heard from the representatives of the people. So this Serbian Assembly of 48 was in essence that, but some of the deputies that were there were already young people educated abroad or at the Lyceum that was instituted in Serbia that had some modern ideas. Some of them heard many things from the Hungarian Revolution, and they wanted to demand new rights. They wanted to demand that an assembly becomes a constitutional category, that it has to be summoned every year, etc., etc. Since the assembly at that time was relatively informal, no protocols were kept, we can't see who said what, but in the collection of laws for 48, again in that old manner of the ruler responding to the requests of his people, Prince Alexander published the list of the demands made on the assembly and his answers to them, so whether he will heed those demands, in what manner, or why not. And there's a long list of 95 items listed by the number of people who asked for them, or rather the representatives of a number of districts. There were 17 districts in Serbia at the time. Naturally, we can't go through all of them. The only thing that all 17 districts asked for was not a political matter, it was the matter that the judiciary was very slow. So from everywhere in the country, people were complaining, when you go to court, it will take years until you get to justice. And the prince essentially replied, yes, yes, we know, we're working on it. The second highest demand, and the number of them after that, concerned political power, concerned the need to summon the assembly regularly. Some people said every year, some found once in every 3 years to be acceptable, but to have a regular period. There were some demands for the executive power as well, for example, to limit various forms of corruption and nepotism, to make the 17 members of the state council representatives of each of the 17 districts, which had been initially the idea when the constitution was drafted, but it did not make it into the final version that the Sultan passed, and so on. And there is one minor demand that I would like to draw your attention to that was only made by the Belgrade district, so the district the capital was in, and that was the demand for the freedom of press. So the village people did not really care about that, but the urban population of the capital was concerned about the freedom of the press, because at that time there was an act on censorship, so everything had to be given to the authorities to read and maybe modify before it could be published. Naturally, even the Belgrade district accepted that there should be some limitations if, say, the prince was insulted or the Ottoman Porte or something along the lines, but let the press generally be free as far as internal political matters are concerned. But to that, the prince replied that, I quote, "The freedom of press in our fatherland is not subject to any other limitations but those which are demanded by the interests of the fatherland and other necessary concerns based on the current state of the education in our country." In other words, we can't do anything about that. We think everything is perfect as it is. Regarding the demands for political representation, a committee was formed to draft a National Assembly Act, which was pretty good for that time. So the assembly was supposed to be summoned for every year. It did not become a legislative body, but it was a necessary consultative body. It would have some form of supervision over the executive and so on, but it remained just a draft. So the prince did not decide to risk passing it. Now we fast forward 10 years to 1858. During that time, naturally, various political and legal matters that are interesting happened, but 58 is the end of the regime of Aleksandar Karađorđević and the defenders of the constitution. After a number of scandals and the conflicts between them, various members of the opposition, including the said liberals, or a newer generation, younger generation of liberals, but also the supporters of the banished Obrenović dynasty, demand that an assembly be summoned. At first, the prince is very reluctant to do that, but they insist. Some of the liberals even start agitating in the countryside, which is very unusual for them because they were educated and they generally had a snobbish attitude towards the masses, but some of them even consort with the masses to try to get them to demand the assembly. And the prince agrees, but decides to do it in a more formal way. A new National Assembly Act is passed, which is based on the 48 draft, though slightly less liberal than that would have been. But generally, they try to make the assembly less dangerous by formalizing it. So in this National Assembly Act, there are many detailed rules regarding elections, procedure, and so on. The earlier assemblies were essentially held in open air with people coming on horseback, armed. There were no special rules of how to speak, how to vote, etc. Now they are trying to put the assembly into those confines to keep it more civilized and to prevent it from becoming a revolutionary assembly. However, it still does. At that assembly, Aleksandar Karađorđević was dethroned, and although there were multiple candidates, old Miloš Obrenović was summoned back to rule Serbia once again. The assembly also passed a new National Assembly Act. It had an initial draft that was very revolutionary. If you read the first few articles, you can hear them in French, essentially, about how the National Assembly is sovereign, how it is a crime of treason to try to limit it, etc. But those of the members of the council who were communicating with the liberals, Ilija Garašanin most of all, managed to persuade them to tone it down regarding two things. First, to limit the assembly's competence, not to say that no important act can't be passed without its acceptance, but only without it being consulted. And second, that the assembly, the 58th assembly, does not attempt to pass the act on its own, which it wanted to do in a revolutionary manner, but to direct it to the state council and the prince as the formal legislative bodies at the time. So they concede. The act is passed only in January 59, after Miloš Obrenović has already come, and it is reduced by a few degrees. I will have, of course, more details in the paper regarding suffrage rights and competence and so on, but I don't want to bore you with the details right now. So essentially, the assembly becomes a part of the system of organs now, but it is still not too important. Several years after that, in 1861, Miloš Obrenović has already died, and his son Mihailo, who is more educated, more modern, but not necessarily more liberal, comes to the throne, and he changes the constitution via facti by issuing a set of organic laws. He wanted to pass a new constitution. He was very concerned by the fact that Serbia was still under Ottoman rule. He had an offer from the Sultan: here's a blank piece of paper, write whatever you want on it, but it has to be issued by the Sultan. But that's exactly what he wanted to avoid. So he issues a set of laws, essentially increasing the power of the prince, decreasing the power of the council, separating the government, the ministerial council, as a new organ from that point, but also putting forth the assembly as a necessary category, but not still as a legislative body. The assembly is to be summoned once every 3 years. It has to be consulted on matters such as taxation or the loss of state territory or whatever else the prince sees fit to put forth to it. But there is also a great assembly which is to be summoned in the cases where there's a problem with the throne. Say the prince dies without an heir or wants to adopt an heir, or an underage prince comes to power and the regency needs to be appointed. And that last part turned out to be needed. Again, 10 years fast forward, in 1868, when Prince Mihailo was assassinated and his underage cousin Milan came to the throne, a regency was appointed, and the regency, in conjunction with the liberals, who were again raising a great discontent with Mihailo's fairly authoritarian regime, the regency decides to change the constitution, which is passed in 1969 and is known as the Regency Constitution. Although it was illegal to change the constitution during the prince's minority, they do it anyway. Although the prince and the state council, just having consulted the assembly, need to change the constitution, they decide to summon the Great Assembly to adopt the constitution in order to satisfy the liberals, because the dynasty is down to one 14-year-old boy. They don't want to risk another revolution. So in that constitution, we have a huge compromise. Give the liberals something, but not too much. They want a parliament. Give them a parliament. The parliament becomes a legislative body. But the parliament may vote upon laws, but it does not have legislative initiative. It cannot propose laws. Only the prince through the government can do that. The parliament is composed of 3/4 of the people, but on every 3 deputies that the people elects in free elections, the prince may appoint one person of those who excel in experience in state affairs, etc. So it's a sort of a compromise. According to this constitution, press is free within the boundaries of the law. So essentially, whatever law regarding the press is passed, that will be the case, and it will be constitutional, and in the very next year a press act is passed which is all but free in essence. Again, there will be more details in the paper, but I see my time is running out, so I'll be short. One small point before we get to the end is 1881. That's an important year because 2 important laws were passed by the new progressive government then. One was the Press Act, which made the press really fairly free in practice. and the other was the Gatherings and Associations Act, which allowed for the first time the formal organization of political parties. It also allowed free gatherings for non-political purposes and only with prior registration for political purposes and so on. But although there had been for decades political groups, informal groups, which were known, liberals, conservatives, later the progressives who had been the new conservatives, etc., this time, for the first time, we can register political parties. And it shows, for example, it's a good illustration of what the climate was at the time, that people saw that as as a step forward, but one that probably won't last. So Jovan Ristić, the head of the Liberal Party, a man with great political experience, he was the Serbian representative at the Congress in Berlin when we gained independence in '78. He had been one of the regents for Prince Milan and so on. He registers the Liberal Party, but not as a political party. He registers it as a private company for the purpose of promoting Serbian education, because he believes that in a year or two, when the government changes, the possibility to have registered political parties will be abolished again. But it does not, and we culminate in another 8-year in 1888, when a new constitution is passed, which finally brings a parliamentary government to Serbia, so an assembly that not only passes acts, but has legislative initiative, that can fully control the budget, control the government, that is fully elected, although a certain percentage of deputies have to have a faculty degree or experience in state affairs that we've been talking about after the first session, and the press is free unless the Serbian ruler, a foreign ruler, is insulted or the people is incited to revolt. Now, of course, this happy ending 40 years later is not the end, because this constitution, again, did not excel in practice. It was abolished by Aleksandar Obrenović some years after it was passed. The old constitution was returned to force, etc., etc. The road to actual parliamentary government was long and thorny, but we could say that these 4 decades, from the first loud and public declaration of such ideas as the need for a government of the people, and at first a quiet voice asking for the freedom of press, managed to culminate in those 4 decades. I thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions afterwards.